All right. All right. So just a basic overview of what we're going to be doing today. I want to go over a brief history of Delta-8, just where it came from. I was curious myself how long it's been around. We're going to talk about what is chemical structure. So Sean, great presentation, by the way. Thank you for that. And a great transition. You brought up how substantially similar really was never legislatively defined. When I started working with the Analog Act over a decade ago, my biggest question from a chemical standpoint was, what is chemical structure? They never bothered to define that legally either. So we're going to go over that and talk about the two-dimensional molecular geometries, three-dimensional MGs. We're going to talk about the MEP calculations for phytocannabinoids because those are a great way to talk about the electronic structure of the compound. I know a lot of people have questions about production, and so we are going to go into the rearrangement of cannabidiol, the isomerization, lots of different methods out there. I'm not going to get too crazy into it, but at the end of this, you'll see a variety of different contact information. If you have questions you want to nerd out, get to me at one of the emails and we'll talk about it. But I definitely want to talk about lab testing and some of the pharmacological implications based on the chemistry that we're seeing. So from here, brief history. Yeah, it was first reported University of Illinois in the early 1940s. The journal I saw on it was August 1951. A couple interesting things I noted. They produced it with isomerism from cannabidiol 80 years ago, same thing we're doing now. And they thought that they had a really efficient reaction at the time. They bragged about it in the paper, and turns out it really wasn't that good. But human volunteers, even at that time, were signing up to try it out and see what happens. I thought that was funny because that was just a few years after the Marijuana Tax Act, and already the scientists were out seeing what was going on with the plant. So fast forward to the mid 60s, I believe it was 1966. That's when Delta-8-THC like it was actually structurally characterized from cannabis, and that led to more complete stereo-specific methods of production. And don't want to get too long-winded on that because I really want to focus on the definition of chemical structure because not only from a chemical and pharmacological standpoint, but also from a legal standpoint, as Sean mentioned, uh, legislatively, we need to know what these terms mean. So the three primary components, the first of which is molecular geometry, is the one that I think most people are familiar with. If you were to Google CBD structure, that stick image with the letters, that's molecular geometry. So it's two or three dimensional arrangement of the atoms in a molecule, shape, bond length, bond angles, torsional angles, which if you didn't brush up on those this morning, no worries, it's not as complicated as it sounds. We'll see those in the structures later. And basically, it's what most people associate with chemical structure. And up until this point, that's what's mostly been used in a court of law. And that's why, starting 10 years ago, I started focusing more on the electronic and crystal structures of compounds to show that there's substantial dissimilarities in those as well. So electronic structures, it's just the motion of electron, around a molecule, basically the electromagnetism, and usually involves really advanced quantum calculations. But MEP is the molecular electrostatic potential analyses. They're really quick and easy ways to analyze those electronic structures. Crystal structure, we're not going to talk about too much today, but I want you to be aware of it. So this is two-dimensional molecular geometry. I think we're all pretty familiar with it. Shows two different representations. You'll see Delta 9 on the right has a couple hydrogen atoms there coming, and then on the left you don't see them. Really why it shows those was the lines coming in and out. These are two-dimensional images, but they're supposed to be three-dimensional representations. So when you see things going, goofy looking lines like that, that's just trying to emphasize the three-dimensional nature of the compound. And obviously, as Rick and Sean have mentioned, the primary difference, but what separates these compounds in their molecular geometry, is the location of a double bond. You see in that top left ring system. So Delta-8-THC, it's between the 8 and 9 positions. Delta-9-THC, it's between the 9 and 10 positions. So depending on the chemical, there's always a numbering system to tell you, what is what. It depends on the different ring systems you're dealing with, so I don't want to get too long-winded with that there. What I do want to explain, and I think this is important because I know there's people with different knowledge bases of chemistry here. I just want to make sure I'm on time. When you're looking at these structures, the bottom right of each compound has what's called a pentyl chain. That zigzag goes down, up, down, up, down. I know just looking at things chemically that is 5 carbons and as many hydrogens as it needs to be stable. That top left, I know that's CH3 because it's a carbon as many hydrogens needs to be stable. The reason that's important is because when you and OH hydroxy, if you learn a little basic chemistry and the stability behind it, we'll go into, you're going to start seeing what in the coming years will be played with, like that pentyl chain and some of the substituents off on the top left, and that's going to really cause dramatic impacts in pharmacological effect as well as chemical structure. So I wanted to include a comparison to CBD and CBN as well, because what you'll see, the main difference, obviously, one's an agonist, one's an antagonist, and the biggest difference is obviously the broken ring system. So on the left, Delta-8-THC, tetrahydrocannabinols in general are actually tricyclic terpene or terpenoids. They're derivatives of terpenes. They're basically oxygenated terpenes, and so somewhere in the structure you can find it. Um, the reason that that's interesting, tricyclic 1, 2, 3 ring systems. CBD, this antagonist, it has a broken ring system. Doesn't look too different at the two-dimensional level, but three-dimensionally it makes a very big difference. We're going to see that in a second. Also, really wanted to bring up a comparison. Oh, not too far, to CBN, because as Rick has pointed out too, stability is critical, especially when it comes to these isomers. So these things are going to, spontaneously isomerize based on their environmental conditions and where they feel most stable when. And CBN, as we talk about, Delta-9 is going to degrade more rapidly into CBN compared to Delta-8 because Delta-8 is more stable. CBN is kind of like where every compound is trying to eventually get to in stability. And you'll notice that CBD, Delta-8, and Delta-9 are all isomers with the formula C21, H30O2, and that's later in the presentation. Cannabidiol, very similar, 26 carbons, 21 carbons, 2 oxygens, and 26 hydrogens. And those losses of hydrogens are what actually ends up making the compound a little more stable. And we'll see that in a second. Wanted to bring up, when I brought up the chains before too, you might hear about THCV and THCP. One of them is just on the left here, Chase. It's just the propyl homolog. It means that instead of a 5-carbon chain, it's got a 3-carbon chain. THCP, same thing, 7 carbons instead of 5. The reason that's important is because as we start studying the pharmacology of these compounds, I think we're going to find drastic differences based on compounds that allegedly should behave similarly based on some of the past experiences we've had. So now we're going to get into three-dimensional molecular geometry. I apologize for anybody that's looking at this and wishes that I was spinning them around. I do that in real time, and I will put out videos later so you can see how I'm arriving at these. When we tried it via Zoom with the wireframes and the way I wanted to do things, it just didn't come through and render right. So in looking at this, you'll notice that at the top, if you look at the wireframe of these molecules, the double bonds where they're supposed to be, the ball and stick models don't show them. It's just a software thing. But I wanted to show you, when we're talking those torsional angles I joked about earlier, what you'll see even three-dimensionally here, and you can really see it when you spin it, is that the first 2 ring systems are lay pretty flat. And I'll show you that in a second. But then the third one, it's because of the differences in bond length, bond angles, because of that difference in the position of the double bond, it has to contort itself in order to actually remain stable. And so that's another big thing. You'll see a side angle here. I turned it around and flipped it so that that red dot is one of the oxygens, one of the oxygen atoms in the molecule. Everything below it in that straight line is actually 2 ring systems, almost perfectly lined up. You'll see a little bit of contortion just below the red, but pretty stable. And then the third ring system at the top is contort. It has to be, because that's the only way that can find stability. You look at, I wanted to include this too, just because when we're talking about these balls and sticks, really all these individual atoms and molecules are just amalgamations of energy, working together to form stability and create the compounds that we know. Here's CBD. I want to show you flat CBD. So again, you can see broken up ring structures. This is flat, a little different on the left. I don't want to go too far into this because the videos were better, but I want to get to CBN now and how you can see the stability. Keep in mind that in the wireframes, the top left and bottom right ring structures have as many they're not really double bonds. They're like 1.5 bonds, but it's a hydrogen structure that keeps the compound stable. And this is where you can really see it. When you flip it, you can see all 3 of those rings are almost horizontal. Obviously you can see a little bit of contortion there just to the left of that front facing oxygen atom, but you can start to see the stability three-dimensionally as you start, playing with some of these compounds in the software. And down the road, I'll show you some more exciting things. So that's all molecular geometry. Now I want to talk about the electronic structures of things. And this was over a decade ago. That's why I started this software, because I had to figure out a way to show, judges, potential juries, an electronic structure that made sense without getting into like quantum mechanics. So this is what I came up with. It's pretty easy to understand blobs of color. So what we do is we calculate the magnetic and electronic structure of the molecule using these MEP calculations. I set the software to put in 6 different gradients, depending on polarity and charge. And what you can see here is delta 8 at the top. So now I made it transparent so you can see the structure. And we've agreed that the 2-dimensional molecular geometry has a lot of similarities, 3-dimensional still some, a little less than 2D. Now we get in the electronic structure, and I can go right here. That's delta 9. So again, we can still see some similarities around the oxygens, as we would expect. The polarity is a little more increased. But this is really interesting when it comes to a substantial similarity standpoint, is let's say, I was a fan of Impressionist paintings, right? And I wanted a Monet in my living room, but I didn't have that kind of money. So I hired somebody to make something that was substantially similar. And if I showed them this picture and they then delivered this one, I'd say, hey, great work, but it's not substantially similar to what I ordered. I don't want to hang it in my living room. So obviously I included, and when I have the videos and I'm doing this real time in 3D, it's a lot more impressive because you can see just how different they are three-dimensionally, because the other sides of the molecules that you can't see are pretty different. The idea is that the shape and polarity of these electronic structures, there's a solid argument to be made that they're substantially dissimilar. But again, that's for the courts to decide. So if you want a side-by-side comparison, that's a pretty good one. I also included the MEPs for CBD and CBN in case your notes. Obviously, down the road, and there's a lot more calculations to do, but I think we're in our infancy of understanding the pharmacology behind some of these electronic structures and why some are producing agonism versus antagonism at certain receptors. And the pharmacology part's coming, so we'll get there soon. Definitely want to talk about production rearrangement via isomerization. I know that there's a lot of people using a lot of different methods. The labs I source from, there's 3 different methods that I really like, and I've encountered numerous other ones and just not as educated about them, but I am educated about the chemistry behind them. People are kind enough to invite me in their labs and nerd out with me out of respect for them and their intellectual property. I don't want to go too in depth with it. Again, if you want to contact me personally, we can talk about it, but I do want to go over just the basis of what's occurring. So let me see if I can move this here. Get this out of the way. Yeah, sorry about that. So Delta-8, Delta-9, CBD, they're all isomers like we talked about. They share the same chemical formula, C21H30O2, just arranged in slightly different ways. CBN, again, chemically related, but arguably more stable because it lost the hydrogens it didn't need that was messing it up. As isomers, they can spontaneously rearrange themselves depending on environmental conditions. And that's why I know that there's been some controversy about, does the plant make Delta 8? Is it naturally occurring? All right, I've seen some arguments that the plant isn't supposed to be able to make this. I've seen conflicting arguments. Nonetheless, whether it can make it or not, you can pull a cannabis plant out of the ground and detect Delta-8. They did it way back in the 60s. That's how they characterized it for the full synthesis. So the reason I bring that up is whether it's the plant doing it or whether the plant is producing Delta-9-THC that is due to environmental conditions naturally isomerizing, it is naturally occurring, and it is part of the plant, a constituent when you pull it from the ground and test it. So again, multiple different routes to obtain nearly identical results. Um, and again, we're talking about the hemp-derived production of Delta-8. I cannot place enough emphasis on that. Thank you, Sean, for emphasizing that. Hemp-derived production begins with extracting and isolating CBD from hemp, and then from there, it generally involves a pH modulation. There are some, neutral routes out there and stuff like that, but generally, somebody is going to try to put it in a more acidic environment, and in the presence of the right concentrations, right conditions, it does it itself. We're not doing much of anything. It just spontaneously starts isomerizing into a combination of tetrahydrocannabinols the same way it did in 1941. And then that's, again, they had a mixture of a bunch of different type tetrahydrocannabinols there. Obviously, we've gotten much better over the years of getting exactly what we want out of the product. So anyway, there's always talk about color, and this is one of the things I want to talk about. The different acids, different catalysts, which at times are acids for these reactions, and different post-wash methodologies are all going to contribute to the final color. Um, the reason I bring up color, you're going to hear a lot of people ask questions about bleach. Oh, I heard they're bleaching it and stuff. And when I hear bleach, I think of hypochlorite ions in solution. Same when I hear ammonia, I think NH4 plus ions in solution. Uh, what you may be hearing more about, I hope, is bleaching clays, which have been used in a variety of industries for a variety of different similar reasons. I hope that's what you're. If anybody's putting hypochlorite ions in this stuff, get them out of the industry. So, all right. So lab testing. This is one that a lot of people have trouble with. I included the kind of the basis of chromatography and mass spec. I don't claim to be an expert on either one. I'm much more familiar with mass spec, but my brother's a chemical engineer, and so he would let me live unless I fully understood chromatography at some point in my life. So it is pretty simple. It's as simple as dissolving a fluid or dissolving your product into a fluid, which can be a gas, a solvent, water, methanol, ethanol, whatever. That's your mobile phase or phases. And it carries through a column. And basically, that column, the stationary phase, it's something that different compounds want to stick to for different amounts of times, basically, different binding affinities. And so, like how long that compound or that test sample is in the column is what we refer to as retention times. And mass spec, like I said, you're just breaking the molecule apart, either bombarding with electrons or hitting it with energy, and it breaks up into its constituent ions, its fragments. And at that point, you had a puzzle piece, and you just put together what more than likely the structure is going to look like. So, a combination of chromatography and mass spec will yield your results. Gas chromatography used to be more common. Most people have switched to liquid chromatography. HPLCs, high performance liquid chromatography. And that's because, as most of us know by now, gas chromatography, which is run around 300 degrees Celsius, that's more than enough energy to decarboxylate the compound. And my personal opinion is that THCA and Delta-9 are two different compounds and should be quantified as such, but I don't write the laws. So I'm playing ball with what they say. I do want to note that, again, I believe that we're in our infancy for testing and testing methodologies. I don't believe that the industry will be as successful as it could be if we just keep limiting ourselves to chromatography and mass spec. I think over the next 2 or 3 years, you're going to start to see a lot of testing solutions that don't require 2 and 3 day turnaround times and really, I guess, less of a margin of error. And throughout the 2 and 3 years, we can talk about it and talk more about what I think the future holds. The reason this is important is not only are you guys, potentially buying, selling products, transferring across state lines. So of course, you don't want anything to be hot, but there's also some drug testing implications. So just to basically tell you what is causing the problem between Delta-8 and Delta-9, which has since mostly been fixed. It's the fact that they do have similar retention times and they do have similar post-ionization molecular fragments. And that's why, a lot of labs are erroneously reporting Delta-8 as Delta-9 because if their equipment or their softwares aren't calibrated, they're not going to get those peaks or are too close. Same thing with CDC and D10. We're seeing a lot of that right now as well. Um, One of the things, most of the labs have gotten better. I kind of like the fact that they're making labs register with the DEA and making it easier to do so because I do want, you know, the calibrations are very important to what we're doing in research and development. And it's very important too with drug testing because I know there's a lot of people that talk about this, blah, blah, blah. Here's the science behind it. When you take a drug test, like usually a dipstick test, it's programmed to test for the presence of the drug and its metabolites, right? And so obviously Delta-8 and Delta-9, it could definitely trick a test. I could see that happening just because obviously if the peaks on chromatograms are that similar, how's a dipstick going to test it? When you send it into a lab, we've had confirmation personally, if the lab is capable of separating Delta-8 from Delta-9 and the Delta-8 metabolites from Delta-9 metabolites, you're fine. But if that lab isn't calibrated to do that, then they're going to think they're looking at D9 and D9 metabolites, and you could find yourself in a bad situation. And above and beyond all things, the reason I'm in this industry is to try to help and try to move our society forward. I don't want to see anything bad happen to anybody, so I just wanted to be candid about that. Um, Now the pharmacological implications, and I'm almost done. They're both CB1 and CB2 receptor agonists. The inhibitory constant, the Ki, for D8, it's higher than D9 at CB1 and CB2. Um, the higher the actual inhibitory constant, the less potentially psychotropic or psychoactive it would be. So D9, it's stronger. It's got a stronger constant, so it's making more of an impact at CB1 and CB2. Delta-8, not so much. The reason that I think it's really important to talk about this is that we haven't really adequately modeled our endocannabinoid systems, what receptors are doing what. It's great to talk about CB1 and CB2 receptors all day, but that's why I put in those three receptor sites specifically. There's a lot of different novel activity at GPR18, GPR55, GPR119, and we got to start studying that because, as I talked about before, as we start playing with these molecules in the research and development arenas, whether it be the alkane chains, we're substituting those substituents, or playing with the top left, they're going to have a huge impact on not just CB1 and CB2. And what we see right now is the pharmacological profiles of Delta-9, Delta-8 being limited to CB1 and CB2. I don't think that that's doing those compounds justice in terms of complete pharmacological profiles. So, I'm hoping that down the road we get to spend a little more time looking into that stuff. So I guess, obviously we're going to open this up to questions. If you want to contact me, there's three different places. If you want to nerd out, if this is molecular or product formulation based, email me at matt.delta8.science. Anything about the American Cannabinoid Association, which is really a big passion project for me this year. We're going to be doing a lot of fundraising and doing a lot of stuff with HIA. Definitely anything associated with this presentation or moving forward with the industry, please email the HIA directly, whether it be Rick, Ryan, and you can CC me at matt@americancannabinoids.org. And then for any information about commercializing your endeavors, especially with our vertically integrated hemp company, contact me at mattindustrialhempfarms.com. And otherwise, I really appreciate the time, and I look forward to contributing however I can in the future. Thank you so much to Rick, Ryan, and Sean. So.